I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer, and the spice must flow. Odds are, if you say either of those little lines out loud, someone nearby will either nod or yell back, "Lisan al-Gaib!" And honestly, that's kind of incredible. Because Dune, a book about space feudalism, desert drugs, and giant sandworms, has no right being a global pop culture icon. After all, it's dense, political, deeply weird, and almost didn't even get published at all. And yet, it has become one of the highest selling and most influential sci-fi novels of all time. But here's the thing. Most people only know book one. What they don't know is that things go completely off the rails after that, in the best and strangest possible ways. I'm talking about space femdom, clone cults, immortal worm emperors with no genitals, all wrapped in a galaxy-spanning warning about the dangers of charismatic leaders. So today we're going to dive into all of it. The strange, brilliant, and deeply layered legacy of Dune. What this series actually even is and what it eventually becomes. And the many adaptations that have sprung up, both the brilliant and bizarre. And finally, where everything is at today to explore what's happening with Dune. Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examined. In this channel, we'll be exploring series, franchises, and more. If that sounds good to you, there is a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons who keep this channel going. You guys rock. Now, usually I cover series that are a bit beyond their prime, and I know that Dune is in a bit of a resurgence right now, but I just had to make an exception because it's so cool. And one more note, there will be mild to mid spoilers throughout the video, and I'll give another spoiler warning before I go into major spoiler territory. So how does one explain a series as huge, influential, and frankly insane as Dune? To do a full deep dive, you need at least 10 hours, 3 mentats, and probably a few stiff drinks filled with some spice. Now, you might think you know Dune. Maybe you've read the books, maybe you've seen the movie, but trust me when I say that there are levels to this. If you're one of the many people who stopped reading after the first book, you might be surprised to learn that, well, the story never really ended. We're talking decades of sequels, prequels, short stories, spin-offs, and the books are still coming out over 6 decades later. Now, these later books dive headfirst into some endearingly strange territory, wildly described sex scenes, and immortal godlike beings who seemingly look like that couple from the Farmer painting, American Gothic. So to even begin to make sense of all of this, we first need to make sure we're on the same page about the first Dune. Well, chances are everyone and their mama has read, watched, or heard something about Dune and probably knows the basic plot, right? Our Lord and Savior, our golden boy, Paul Atreides, goes on a fun-filled adventure, takes out the bad guys, and becomes the noble leader of mankind, gets the girl, rock and roll. Well, you are wrong on pretty much all counts. Because at its core, Dune is a critique of the hero's journey wrapped in a burrito of commentary on ecology, bureaucracy, and the manipulative nature of power. Now, it looks like a classic revenge story, but it's actually a sharp deconstruction of Messiah worship, environmental collapse, and the illusion of the heroic destiny. And to properly explain all this, we need to walk it back and set the stage for this world, because trust me, the world building is central to what makes Dune Dune. There are so many interesting concepts and factions that each deserve their own hour-long video, because everything in this world building has a reason for existing. One event naturally leads to the next, event A triggers event B, which sets off event C, and so on and so on. And I think a lot of people don't realize just how dark, oppressive, and suffocating this world really is, which actually shouldn't be that surprising because the entire universe is essentially a warning. So let's do a quick and dirty history of the Dune universe. At some point in our far future, humanity, being the greedy sausages we are, colonized the stars, spread out, took over, and kept doing our thing. But of course, no sci-fi universe is complete without a little apocalyptic events, and Dune delivers. Because somewhere along the way, things got a little messy. See, as humanity expanded across the stars, we needed better tools, so we built them. Artificial intelligence, or in the Dune universe, known as thinking machines. And for a while, it was great. Until it really wasn't. Turns out giving all your control over to machines is a pretty bad idea, and the people controlling those machines may or may not have a penchant for enslaving humans without machines. Who knew? So we got the Butlerian Jihad, one of the single most important events in the Dune timeline. Basically, humanity went to war with AI. Now, I think a lot of people will hear that and go, oh my god, okay, Skynet, we get it, machines equal bad. But it is way deeper than that. This was a war against dependence on machines. So after humanity rage quit the machine era, they basically hit the big red reset button. And Dune's entire world is built from that point forward. Basically, humans pushed to their absolute limits, which in my opinion is one of the most fascinating sci-fi premises out there. Because once you take out thinking machines, you still need to think, right? So in lieu of the machines, we got the Mentats. Basically, human computers trained to calculate and analyze at levels that would make your average spreadsheet cry. But what are spreadsheets without travel? So we also got the Spacing Guild, basically weirdo space navigators who fold space with their brains and run a monopoly on faster than light travel. Some of them may or may not be mutated weird floating flesh things in tanks, but we don't talk about them. Everyone kind of hates them, but guess what? You really need them. And finally, we come to probably the most interesting faction, which is really saying something, the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit are like space witches if space witches were also geneticists, politicians, secret agents, religious engineers, walking lie detectors, and also knew super fast kung fu. They have complete control over their own bodies and can even change the gender of their baby at will, with their long-term plan to birth the Kwisatz Haderach, a being who can see all possible futures and kind of break time itself. So, in service to this mission, the Bene Gesserit are pulling strings behind the scenes to make this happen, and you can bet that there are a lot of strings to pull. Because Dune isn't some shiny utopia. This is straight up space feudalism. The galaxy is ruled by an emperor, but for all you 40k nerds out there, if you're thinking some shiny god emperor, you are way off the mark. In Dune, the emperor is not all powerful, and in fact, he actually has a really hard job managing the different factions and to balance the power of the great houses, which basically think noble families with planets for their backyards. And to make matters worse, everyone kind of hates each other, from House Atreides, the noble-ish good guys, to the Harkonnen, who basically just kind of suck. Imagine the worst traits of capitalism, fascism, sadism, and gluttony rolled into one big, sweaty, evil house. Eat, sex, devour, repeat. Now, technically, there is kind of a space UN, the Landsrat, where the noble houses gather to play nice and pretend that they aren't constantly plotting to kill each other, but let's be real, this is not kumbaya in the cosmos. Scheming and assassination are practically business as usual. So bottom line, the Dune universe kind of sucks to live in. And speaking of terrifying and terrible stuff in this universe, there's so much deep cut world building here that we don't have time to fully unpack, but I'd be remiss not to at least name drop some of the highlights because there are some really cool things in here. So we got the Talaxiu, a secretive society of morally questionable bioengineers / religious fundamentalists who are shunned by the rest of the universe because they do weird stuff like grow replacement humans that are basically memory wiped clones with complications. Let's also not forget the shields, basically personal force fields that block anything that move too fast, which makes guns largely useless in this universe, and sword fights are very much back in fashion. Now, this may sound like a wild mix of ideas, and you would not be wrong, but the one thing holding all of these wild concepts, factions, and general debauchery in space together is spice. Forget oil, forget Bitcoin. In Dune, the most valuable substance in the universe is spice. It's basically a drug that expands consciousness, grants heightened awareness, and occasional glimpses of the future, extends life, and in high enough doses, it lets you bend space and time like origami. Every major faction in the galaxy, political, religious, economic, needs it. But, as my auntie would say, just because it opens your mind doesn't mean it won't fry it. Spice is intensely addictive, mind-altering, and completely impossible to manufacture artificially. So yes, this entire galaxy runs on people who love to get high. And the one place and one place only that it comes from is the desert planet of Arrakis, also known as Dune, which makes Dune the most important planet in the galaxy, which is a bit of a bummer because no matter how the Dune tourist agency tries to spin it, Dune is kind of a death trap. A scorched desert world teeming with skyscraper-sized sandworms, and water is so scarce that the locals reclaim moisture from dead bodies, which you don't want to know the details on that one. Speaking of the locals, the Fremen, as they're known, are tough, resourceful, and absolutely radical people who've adapted to a death world by wasting zero water and enduring. And one thing a lot of adaptations skip over is just how ruthless the Fremen really are. These are not noble desert wanderers. Herbert was fascinated with how landscapes shape the people that live in them, and Arrakis shaped the Fremen into survival-hardened warriors, and even the children being taught to kill the wounded on the battlefield. And all of these delicious moving parts brings us finally to the first book, Dune. Now, like I said before, 90% of you probably already know the story in all of its iconic glory, but for those of you who don't or need a quick refresher, here we go. Essentially, the Emperor gets nervous that House Atreides is getting too popular because they're actually competent and actually inspire loyalty, unlike literally everyone else in the setting. So the Emperor sets a trap. He hands them control of Arrakis, the only source of spice in the universe, and sets a trap with the Harkonnens to wipe them out for good. So, in one corner, we got Paul Atreides, and he is not your average brooding noble son. This kid has been trained since birth by the deadliest order of psychic space nuns, the Bene Gesserits, Mentats, and elite swordmasters like the famous Duncan Idaho. He has been bred for greatness, but also for manipulation. From the very beginning, Paul is painfully aware that he's a pawn to a bunch of overlapping power games. But that does not mean he's going to play. So when the powder keg of Dune, finally explodes, Paul and his mother flee into the desert where he finds refuge with the Fremen. And that is where Paul starts to awaken, not just metaphorically. He begins unlocking his prescient abilities, seeing branching futures and holy wars igniting in his name. And the Fremen behind him see him as their prophet, as he takes control of the Empire and revenges himself on the Harkonnens. Which is a nice, clean arc, right? Paul becomes the Messiah, wins the war, rides off on his worm into the sunset, probably with some shredded space metal blaring, as Stilgar, the leader of the Fremen / best hype man ever, Slav squats behind him. And sure, on surface value, this might sound like a flashy, action-packed, pulpy sci-fi epic, but funnily enough, Herbert doesn't really dwell on big battles. Even the so-called final conflict is wrapped up basically in a few pages. What Dune actually lingers on is the internal war. Paul's dawning realization that he's at the center of a prophecy he never asked for, and one that he can't fully escape, and one that's quickly spiraling into something horrifying. And those ideas is what the rest of the series capitalizes on. And if you thought Dune was strange, oh buddy, that was just the gateway drug. And quick heads up, there will be spoilers for the rest of this section. See, Frank Herbert didn't write the sequel, Dune Messiah, in 1969 because he wanted to give you a satisfying conclusion. Allegedly, he actually wrote it because people completely misunderstood the first book, and they saw Paul as the hero. But, as we talked about before, one of Herbert's main ideas behind Dune was the idea that people should be wary of messiahs. So Dune Messiah hammered that message home. So now we find Paul as Emperor, haunted, broken, and eventually blind. The population is split between people who worship him and also those who are terrified of him. Billions have died in his name, and he's stuck on this rails-bound vision of the future, and he hates it, and this all eventually culminates with him walking into the desert alone. And it does not feel like a victory because it's not one. Oh yeah, also Duncan Idaho is resurrected as a weird clone with his own entire character arc, and if you thought this kind of bizarre and radical choices were going to end here, oh, no. Because Children of Dune in 1976 shifts the spotlight to Paul's twin children. And these are not your average cute little babies. They've been fully aware of their ancestral memories since birth. It's arguably one of the most divisive books in the series, but it's also what transforms Dune into the sprawling epic it's known as today. Paul himself plays a minimal role here as the narrative hands things off to his son, Leto II. And if nothing else, Children of Dune is worth reading just to witness the beginning of Leto's absolutely wild character arc. Interestingly enough, Herbert originally intended this to be the end of a trilogy, but it actually continues the series' exploration of ecology, fate, and sacrifice, and it ties the first 3 books together in a really satisfying way. But it doesn't even end there, and the next book, The God Emperor of Dune, and I can't believe I'm saying this, dials up the weirdness to straight up fever dream levels, and honestly, I am absolutely here for it. So in 1981, we got God Emperor of Dune, and this is where things truly go off the rails in the best way possible, and it's a fan favorite for good reason. So over 3,000 years after the last book, Leto II, Paul's son, is now a giant worm man with tiny human arms and no genitals, which is surprisingly brought up a lot in this book for some reason. But more important than all of that, he has infinite power. He's turned into a fleshy, philosophical abomination. His brain is spread across his entire body, and he rules the galaxy with a soul-crushing, peacekeeping tyranny. Not because he enjoys it. In fact, he's kind of miserable, bored, and horrifyingly alone, but all the while, he's dropping philosophical banger lines like, quote, "It is difficult to live in the present, pointless to live in the future, and impossible to live in the past." End quote. This entire book is 90% Leto having philosophical debates with endless clones of Duncan Idaho, and even a doomed romance between him and his regular non-worm human fiance. But here's the kicker. Leto wants people to hate him. He becomes this godlike tyrant on purpose so that one day humanity will rebel, which is very Code Geass, and if you get that reference, I love you. But anyway, Leto knows that without his brutal control, humanity will collapse into stagnation, and worse, there's something far more terrifying than even him out there. So his idea forward is the golden path. His plan is to force humanity to scatter and evolve and become so unpredictable that no single force, not even something worse than him, could ever dominate them again. And that's a really cool setup, and as such, Herbert doesn't stop there. After God Emperor things spiral even further into fever dream territory with Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune. We meet the Honored Matres, a faction of sex-weaponized space witches from the unknown reaches of the galaxy, basically like if the Bene Gesserit had a chaotic evil twin with BDSM powers and a vendetta. Duncan Idaho is still around because no one ever truly dies in the series. Seriously, at one point, even Baron Harkonnen is literally whispering murder sex suggestions in a character's head. And if that's still not enough for you, we also got Space Lions with the voice, Jews in space, and a truly unnecessary amount of weird sex, including, yes, genital pulsing, which we're just gonna move on from that one. Now, this all brings us to the big question: what was all of this Godworm, Messiah, space witches even actually about? Because on the surface, it does sound a little bit unhinged, and you wouldn't be wrong. Herbert was definitely going somewhere wild with Dune. But beyond the surface level of the sand, Dune is packed with some of the deepest and honestly most relevant themes you'll find in sci-fi. Because at its core, Dune is about many things: ecology, gender, and more importantly, how humanity can develop and evolve or screw it all up, as well as many, many other things. Nods to colonialism and sucking a planet of its resources is not a subtle nod to oil. And like we touched on before, one of the most interesting and darkest aspects of Dune is that it celebrates the terrifying truth that sometimes the good guy winning is actually kind of a nightmare. Paul's rise brings devastation and oppression, and same with Leto's. Now, this is summed up really nicely with a quote from Herbert. Quote, Personal observation has convinced me that in the power area of politics/economics and in their logical consequence, war, people tend to give over every decision-making capacity to any leader who can wrap himself in the myth fabric of the society. End quote. Even the Fremen, those implacable desert warriors forged in the brutal crucible of Arrakis, eventually fall. In the later books, they're no longer the fierce warriors we met at the start. They got tangled in greed, bureaucracy, and empire just like everyone else. And even aside this huge kind of humanity-level themes, there are smaller and more intimate things being said here. Quote, "Your habits always come hunting after you. The self you construct will haunt you. We are addicted to the self we construct." End quote. So the glue that holds all of this madness together, the worms, the jihads, the psychedelic spice visions, the meditations on time, is the writing. Frank Herbert's prose can be dense, philosophical, and unrelenting, but it's also brimming with ideas. One of the most brilliant and honestly impressive choices he made was the use of in-universe epigraphs before each chapter. These little snippets, often from fictional histories or religious texts, give everything this immense sense of myth, and they really frame the narrative as something ancient. So speaking of his writing, well, who was the man himself? Frank Herbert had what only can be described as an extremely fascinating life. Born in 1920 and raised during the Great Depression, he grew up loving the outdoors and learning to live off the land. Before becoming a novelist, he actually worked as a journalist, a speechwriter, and even served in the Navy. His wife, Beverly, was a crucial creative partner throughout his life. As far as what Dune was inspired by, it's actually kind of easier to say what it wasn't inspired by. Herbert was fascinated by ecology, psychology, philosophy, and religion, and in service of that, he studied Zen Buddhism, Carl Jung, and even dipped into Islamic history while building the world of Dune. So here's how he put it. Quote, "I conceived of a long novel, the whole trilogy as one book about the messianic convulsions that periodically overtake us. Demigods, fanatics, con game artists, the innocent, and the not-so-innocent bystanders. All were to have a part in the drama." End quote. But Dune's success didn't come easy. Now, it was originally serialized in Analog magazine in 1963, but when Herbert tried to publish it as a novel, it was rejected by over 20 publishers. And when it finally did come out in 1965, it didn't even really sell that well. Only later, especially in the 70s, did Dune start to find its massive audience. So yes, a lot of people know Dune, but fewer people know that Dune is part of a series, and almost no one realizes just how massive that series actually is. We're talking over 20 books alone. But even that might be a little bit of heresy to some people because only 6 of those were actually written by Frank Herbert. So let's break it down. If you want the main series, the original 6, the Bibles of the setting, this includes Dune in 1965, Dune Messiah in 1969, Children of Dune in 1966, God Emperor of Dune in 1981, Heretics of Dune in 1984, and Chapter House Dune in 1985. Now, if you're paying attention, this is a wildly long publication history, over 20 years in fact, and that's partly because Frank Herbert kind of kept getting sidetracked with other projects, and honestly, it does show. All the books are packed with kind of shifting ideas and concepts. Apparently, Chapter House Dune was especially difficult for him to write because his wife, Bev, was dying around that time, and she had been a huge emotional and professional anchor for him. And Herbert ended up passing away just 4 years after she did, only a few months after Chapter House Dune hit shelves. And yeah, it ends on a cliffhanger, which was a real bummer to a lot of fans. But fortunately, or not so fortunately, depending on your perspective, the story does continue, just not from Frank himself. His son Brian Herbert, along with co-author Kevin J. Anderson, picked up the reins using Frank's notes to write the final 2 books, Hunter of Dune and Sandworms of Dune. Now, did they actually stick the landing with their version? Well, it depends on who you ask. And look, calling these books divisive is definitely putting it mildly. They also wrote a whole bunch of other prequels and side stories that expand the universe even more. And all of this is really where fans start to argue, because plenty of fans don't see these new books as canon. And even among those who do, reactions kind of range from meh to how dare you. Now, one major issue was that Brian and Kevin kinda take a lot of creative liberties. Case in point, in Frank's version, the Butlerian Jihad wasn't a straight-up robots apocalypse. It was a human-led uprising against the power structure behind the machines. But in the new books, it kind of went full-on killer robots. Then there's the question of why these were even made. Was this the continuation of a labor of love, a tribute to Frank's legacy, or just a cash-in on a legendary IP? So what are these books anyway? Well, let's take a deeper look, because there are multiple series in here. First up, we got Prelude to Dune in 1999. Kind of acts as a prequel set a generation before the original Dune. The books mostly follow the life of a young Duke Leto Atreides, Baron Harkonnen, and Duncan. Then we got Legends of Dune in 2002, and this one dives way back into the Butlerian Jihad, and for some fans, this is where things kind of went off the rails. Because apparently before Frank Herbert's death, he actually approved plans to co-write a book called Prologue to Dune, which was going to be about this, the Butlerian Jihad. But unfortunately, after Frank died, Brian Herbert rewrote these in favor of a more, as we said before, generic version of events, kind of more Terminator AI overlords. Anyway, in 2008, we got Heroes of Dune, and this series is not a sequel, not a prequel, but a in-betweenquel, which there's got to be a better way to say that. But anyway, it's meant to bridge the gaps between Frank's original novels. There were actually supposed to be more, like Leto of Dune, but that was eventually canceled. But actually, as recently as 2023, these have kept coming out. Now, in 2012, we got Schools of Dune. And this trilogy dives into the founding of the great schools after the Butlerian Jihad. That means the early days of the Bene Gesserit, the Mentats, and the Navigators. It's rich with lore, but they're very much still traditional novels. So they aren't styled like in-universe encyclopedias or historical text, which is kind of a missed opportunity in my opinion. I mean, wouldn't an illustrated Dune-style codex have just been awesome? Still, if you like the concept of learning how these institutions came to be, it's a solid read. Now, the newest of the bunch is the Kaladin trilogy, and it focuses on the Atreides family, Duke Leto, Lady Jessica, and young Paul, right before the events of the first novel, Dune. So, wow, that is a lot of books and a lot of trilogies. And the question is, are they actually worth reading? Well, here's the deal. These books aren't Frank Herbert. They're just not. They're written very differently, more action, less introspection, and less philosophy. The tone leans way more pulpy sci-fi than literary sci-fi, and some fans just straight up dismiss them, which is completely fair. That said, some of the books are actually pretty enjoyable if you know what you're getting into. If they've been published under a different name with no ties to Dune, they'd probably be seen as decent space operas. Personally, I've read way worse continuations of series, and honestly, there were a few I genuinely liked, so I don't think it's fair to lump all of the extended Dune books into the do not read pile. Now, that's just me, and I'm not saying that they're better than Frank Herbert's original work, definitely not. But if you're still hungry for more after the original 6-book series, we honestly could have gotten far worse than these. But because they are tied to Dune, one of the most influential sci-fi series of all time, and they do contradict some of Frank's original ideas, people have every right to be critical. So the final word, I don't think they're all bad. Just go in with your expectations in check and decide for yourself. Don't let anyone else decide for you. Aside from the mainline series, there's actually a few short stories and novellas, including Sands of Dune and Tales of Dune. And on top of that, there's tons of other tertiary books in the Dune universe out there with some incredible info, like the Dune Encyclopedia, which is technically not canon, but was apparently published with Frank's approval, and had a great deal of backstory about the Imperium and Dune's technology. So, how do you actually read all of these books? Honestly, it's pretty simple. The general consensus, and one that I totally agree with, is start with Frank Herbert's original 6 books. After all, those are the bedrocks and the Bibles of the setting. Then, if you're still curious, you can dive into the Brian Herbert ones. Now, if you're a madman, or just really dedicated, you can absolutely read the thing in strict chronological order, prequels and all. And I'll drop a guide to that below for anyone who wants to go full Mentat on that. There's also been an incredible full breakdown of reading order for the entire series done by a great fan in the community, Mother Superior, which again I'll link below. Now, Dune, oh Dune, for all those books, it's almost as well known for its mini, and I do mean mini, adaptations, which is kind of wild because Dune is notoriously tough to adapt. You're dealing with a sprawling world, its own vocabulary, and layered books. And even more interesting is that almost none of those adaptations even try to tackle the later books, probably because those are completely unhinged in a great way. Every adaptation is totally different. Wildly different tones, aesthetics, interpretations. Some are incredible, others are incredible in very different ways. So let's start at the top with one of the most divisive and beloved train wrecks of all time. Dune 1984. Yep. Sting in space wearing winged underwear. This movie is certainly something. A lot of people think it's terrible, and it's not like they're wrong, but in a kind of lovable, terrible way. It's ridiculously ambitious, bizarre, oddly beautiful, and absolutely unhinged. In either way, there's just been nothing else like this and probably never will again. The art direction and set design are honestly stunning, and while the special effects have aged like milk in the sun, I mean, the shields look insane, there's still a charm to how committed it all is. One second you're watching an epic space opera, and the next it's full-on Saturday morning cartoon villain monologue. Tonal whiplash doesn't even begin to cover it. The pacing's a mess, which is no surprise, they crammed a ton in, and it was clearly trying to be the next Star Wars, merch and all. And what's especially funny about that is that Herbert actually thought that Star Wars ripped off Dune. Desert planet, check. Young psychic hero, check. Sword fights, check. Yeah, he wasn't thrilled and even considered suing George Lucas at one point. So the idea that poor David Lynch was brought on to basically make Star Wars 2.0 is kind of ironic. Now, one reason for all this chaos is that Lynch didn't get the final cut, which, fun fact, I think this was the last time in his entire career he ever let that happen. Now, there is a 3-hour TV edit of Lynch's Dune floating around where Lynch famously had his name replaced, but poor Lynch. He was coming off The Elephant Man, so expectations were sky high, but the movie bombed and it basically soured him on big studio projects for good. But despite all of that, it eventually became a cult classic. People trash it, sure, but there seems to be a growing appreciation for the sheer weirdness of it all. The whispery inner monologues, the floating barons, it's definitely an experience. If you're curious, Oliver Harper on YouTube did a fantastic retrospective on it, or better yet, just watch the movie yourself. So after the Lynch film kind of imploded, the rights went back to the Herbert estate, and someone had the bright idea, hey, maybe the problem was trying to make Dune into a 2-hour movie, and in strode the Sci-Fi Channel in the year 2000. Now, this miniseries leaned heavily into the book's themes and structure. It was way more faithful in terms of plot and tone, though with a very distinct early 2000s TV sci-fi vibe. Think kind of Stargate. The production values are hit or miss. The CGI was in that beautiful beginning era with this special brand of awfulness, which I personally love, but the costume and visual design definitely have their own flavor. A lot of people took issue with the portrayal of Paul, especially early on, where he plays more as an angsty teen. Interestingly enough, the miniseries also invents a bunch of new material. And while the sequel miniseries, Children of Dune, doesn't actually cover the book Children of Dune until its second half, it's still worth watching because if nothing else, as of today, this is the furthest an adaptation has ever gotten into the Dune books. But of course, Dune also had a long history of almost happened adaptations. The most famous of these is Jodorowsky's Dune, an insane fever dream, allegedly extremely lengthy, surrealist megafilm that was shockingly close to getting made in the 70s. It would have reportedly starred Orson Welles, Salvador Dali, and Mick Jagger, and had some of the coolest concept art I've ever seen. Allegedly, they were even making furniture out of real skeletons. And if you're curious, you definitely have to check out the documentary. Of course, there were other less spectacular failures, including the Paramount attempt in the late 2000s, as well as one by Ridley Scott. But that brings us, of course, to the recent Dune films from 2021. Now, these are massive productions, big budget, high stakes, and genuinely cinematic in a way that sci-fi doesn't always get to be. What really stood out to me was the scale and detail of a world in a very minimal way, and how the story managed to feel epic without drowning in exposition. Now, whether you vibe with it or not, it does feel earnest, and it feels like it's done with real taste and intention. Sure, some people didn't connect with the aesthetic, but love it or hate it, there's no denying that these movies have a clear vision. And it worked. There's a lot of love for the source material here. Denis Villeneuve even calls the books his Bible, and you can really feel that respect shining through. And yeah, for newcomers, these films open the door to a world they might never have explored otherwise. And for longtime fans, they deliver delivered an adaptation that's faithful to the themes of the book with all the anti-colonial undercurrents, the critique of Messiah narratives, and the whole maybe a chosen one isn't actually a good thing idea. It's all in there. Now, whether all of that will carry cleanly through the last film remains to be seen. Part 2 definitely kept the same sense of scale and weight, but also took a few more liberties. Some elements like Stilgar's character were arguably radically simplified, but hey, we all love a good hype man, and Stilgar in the films absolutely became a man of meme legends. Either way, it's hard not to be glad that Dune and sci-fi in general got such a high-profile shot in the arm. These movies brought a ton of new fans into the fold, and that means there's a better chance we'll see more adaptations down the line. And speaking of that, well, that's actually already happened. There's already been a new Dune show, and I was kind of shocked that I hadn't even heard of it, probably because there's just so much Dune content lately. Anyway, Dune Prophecy premiered on HBO in 2024 and actually got mostly positive reviews. It's already been renewed for a second season as of December. Now, the show is set relatively recently after humanity's big win over the thinking machines during the Butlerian Jihad, and was based after the events of Sisterhood of Dune, one of the later prequel novels by Brian Herbert, which was kind of a bold move since those books were never exactly fan favorites. The series definitely tries to capture that Game of Thrones flavor, lots of plotting and political intrigue, but visually it does look great. And if you're into the deeper lore of the Bene Gesserit and the early formation of the Dune universe, it's definitely worth a look. Now, as far as adaptations go, you might be thinking, wow, that is a lot of movies. But my friends, we are only halfway done because Dune also had a long and weird history in the world of video games. First up was Dune in 1992. This was the first real commercial game based on the Dune universe, and it's weird but in a good way. It starts off feeling like an adventure game. You're wandering around the desert, slowly unraveling the plot, but then it sneaks in economic and military strategy, faction, diplomacy, and even ecology. It's actually a great game, especially for its time, and it was a big hit for the publisher. Definitely worth a retro look. Then in 1992, we got, well, Dune 2, The Building of a Dynasty. Now, the name is a little bit of a misnomer because Dune 2 actually has nothing to do with the first game, which is really weird, but it is what it is. Totally different tones and developers. Now, this one was made by Westwood Studios, who would later go on to create Command & Conquer. Technically, I've heard this game described as the very first RTS, which is a real-time strategy game, which I don't know if that's true. I feel kind of skeptical about it. Maybe someone in the comments can confirm, but at the very least, Dune 2 did have at least early iterations of the genre's now standard mechanics. Harvesting resources, building bases, and it does scream classic RTS in its rawest form. Eventually, it would go on to get a remake with Dune 2000 and Emperor Battle of Dune. Now, if you're not into RTS and want something a little different or just straight up bizarre, we got Frank Herbert's Dune in 2001. This game leaned more into action-adventure with stealth and RPG elements. You get dialogue, sneaking, stabbing, all the usual early 2000s jank. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a mess. The tone is weird and the gameplay is clunky and it doesn't really feel that Dune. Now, recently there's been a slew of new games, including Dune Spice Wars in 2023, and this one is a bit of a return to form. It mixes 4X strategy and RTS elements into something that feels like Dune. You pick a major house or faction and try to dominate Arrakis through a mix of spice mining, diplomacy, or sabotage. If you've ever played Northgard, it does have a very similar feel, but with way more sandworms. Finally, this brings us to the most recent game, Dune Awakening, and this is a big budget MMO survival game, but MMO might be a bit misleading here. It's not World of Warcraft, it's more like a shared open world with survival mechanics, with water being a vital resource and sandworms as a constant threat. Basically, everything wants to kill you. The world is gorgeous and gritty with systems that reflect Dune's core themes: scarcity, survival, and ambition. It's still early days for the game, and some players have criticized the in-game content, but it's polished, immersive, and has a ton of potential. It's just really cool to see us in a time where we get such fleshed out games set in the universe. I mean, there are so many other sci-fi series that never get this treatment, and it's great to see because Dune's world is an amazing fit for video games with so much potential. But hey, if none of that is your speed, Dune has also shown up in the world of TTRPGs, though not always smoothly. In 1996, we got Dune Chronicles of the Imperium. Now, if you've never heard of this one, you're not alone. This was a tabletop RPG that had a rough development cycle, delayed by legal issues and changes in publishers. Now, it eventually got released in a super limited run of just 3,000 copies before being shelved, so it's kind of a collector item now. But we did actually get a real one with Dune Adventures in the Imperium in 2021. Published by Modifius, the same folks behind the Mistborn RPG, which I really liked. This is a sleek, serious game that captures the tone of the original novel beautifully. You create your own house, and there are of course different factions to choose from, like the Bene Gesserit, complete with alliances, rivalries, and internal politics. Now, the system leans heavily on story and intrigue over traditional combat, which does fit the setting perfectly. And the book itself is a work of art, great layouts, top-tier illustrations, and a clean, polished aesthetic. If you like Dune and like role-playing, it's 100% worth picking up. Now, if you thought we were done, hold on to your Dune worm, because there's actually still more. Over the years, Dune has spawned a whole smattering of comics and graphic novels, often timed to coincide with the various film releases. There was the 1984 graphic adaptation to go along with the Lynch film, and then a fresh 2021 version tied to that movie. And there's still even more coming out, including House Atreides Volume 1, and it's just fascinating to see all these different artistic takes and interpretations of the worlds and characters. Now, all that being said, it's clear that this series is massive, and honestly, I'm probably missing some adaptations because the world of Dune is just so rich, sprawling, and packed with possibilities, and there's a very good chance we'll see even more content in the future. So that brings us to the question, are we finally reaching the end of Dune? Well, despite the author dying decades ago and the original novel coming out almost 60 years ago, right now we're actually kind of in the middle of another major Dune revival. Of course, on screen, Dune Prophecy has been renewed for a second season, and with the movies, the third installment is officially scheduled for 2026. And recently, Leto II recently has been cast, which means, yeah, undoubtedly, some events from Dune Messiah and possibly Children of Dune will be tackled, which will be fascinating to see. Now, originally, Villeneuve has said that he sees the trilogy ending with Messiah and not pushing further into the weirder, more metaphysical God-Emperor era, admitting that adapting something like God-Emperor of Dune would be a massive challenge. But who knows? If the third movie crushes the box office, that conversation very well might change. I, for one, am really curious about how the third Dune movie will be handled, especially because, well, to avoid spoilers, there's a pretty big character shift at the end of 2. That said, Villeneuve seems hyper aware of how big this change is. And in interviews, he said that the reason for it was that people often misunderstood the point of Dune, seeing Paul as a flawless hero. So at least he is changing stuff like this because of his understanding of the source material as opposed to vice versa, if that makes any sense. Now, on the publishing side, things are a bit quieter, but it's hard to imagine a world where Dune-branded books and tie-ins just stop, especially with the movies, merch, and video games ramping up. And if you're just now getting into Dune, you're joining a fandom that's not only survived decades, but is thriving now. Dune's Reddit is in the top 1% of all subreddits, and the Dune Discord servers are some of the biggest I've ever seen for a single franchise. There is a staggering amount of fan art out there, like truly jaw-dropping. Concept art, 3D models, posters, alternate covers, even fan-made games like Sands where you play as a Fremen, which I'll link below. And all of this has exploded in the wake of the recent movies. And on YouTube, Dune content has never been more accessible or expansive. Massive channels like Quinn's Ideas, Alt-Shift-X, and Invetica have all produced incredible breakdowns of the books, lore, and history. Whether you're a total newbie or a hardcore mentat in training, there is content out there to get lost in. Now, I think one of the many beautiful things about Dune is that every generation seems to rediscover it. In the 70s, it was a cult novel. In the 2000s, it was all about the prequels and the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries. And today, it's the IMAX blockbuster experience. But no matter what the format, Dune keeps resonating. So that begs the question, why does this seemingly strange story about mind-altering drugs, giant worms, scheming space witches, and desert planets keep resonating so strongly generation after generation? Well, I think it's really no surprise. Dune has built such a massive cult following because beneath all of that sci-fi spectacle, there are some seriously relevant themes. ecology, the rise of AI, and the complicated nature of hero worship that are arguably even more relevant today than they were in the 60s. On top of that, the influence Dune has had across pop culture and sci-fi is hard to even quantify. You can see its fingerprints all over stuff like Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Avatar, and even fantasy behemoths like MacLeod have openly talked about how Dune shaped their work. Dune's impact runs deep, and my bet is that it will continue to pretty much as long as sci-fi is a thing. So, in conclusion, the spice must flow, fear is the mind killer, and although many things in pop culture come and go, well, Dune is eternal. Thank you so much for watching. I want to give an enormous shout out to the Dune fandom and community, which was a huge help in making this video, specifically Dune Navigator, Mother Superior, and Dune Info, who were tremendous help fact checking and bouncing ideas off. No shout out is ever complete without shouting out my patrons who keep this channel alive and running. You are the spice to my galaxy spanning empire. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out my Patreon link below, where if you sign up, you get access to cool things like the channel's Discord. As always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's been fascinating to hear what different people have to say. Anyway, thanks again. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.